Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special live stream edition of the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Executive Director William Wolfe, and I'm joined today by a very special guest on a very important and timely topic. We're joined today by Matt Staver. Matt Staver is a senior pastor, and he's the founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel, and he does a whole host of other things. But he's joining us here in the studio today because he is the lead attorney on a case that has been petitioned to the Supreme Court that could potentially overturn the 2015 landmark decision in Obergefell that created the so-called constitutional right to so-called same-sex marriage here in the United States of America. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, William. It's good to be with you to explain and talk about this critically important case.
Yes, and I think there is a lot of explanation that's needed. When the news broke, I've seen a lot of people saying different things, that the Supreme Court is definitely going to hear it, or that Obergefell will definitely be overturned as soon as next summer. And of course, that's not necessarily the matter at hand, but it's a critically important case. So Matt, why don't you just give us a brief bit of your personal background, because you're one of the lead experts in this area, and then tell us about the facts of this case at hand.
Well, I'm a constitutional attorney. My wife and I, who also is an attorney, we founded Liberty Counsel in 1989. We've had 40 wins at the United States Supreme Court since 1989 that we've briefed or argued. One of the most recent wins that I argued at the United States Supreme Court was the case of Shurtleff versus City of Boston, in which we lost 4 times, twice before the district court, twice before the Court of Appeals, and won unanimously 9-0 at the United States Supreme Court in 2022. That particular decision paved the way to overturn a 1971 bad precedent from the Supreme Court known as Lemon versus Kurtzman, that had been used to distort the First Amendment Establishment Clause, that had been used to remove symbols and displays like nativity scenes, 10 Commandments, and also censor Christian viewpoints in public places. And that's how it was used by the City of Boston against our client, Al Shurtleff, founder of Camp Constitution. So we are now looking forward, hopefully, to the Supreme Court taking the Kim Davis case. We just filed what's called a petition for certiorari, or petition for them to review it. We need 4 justices to decide to take a case. We need 5 justices to win. We can talk more about those details and those numbers a little bit later. But it's at that stage where the court now has ordered the other side to respond, and then the court will convene in a conference later this fall. Now it's going to be sometime in October, and they will decide whether to take the case. If they do, they'll set briefing, oral argument. I'll argue the case, and we'll have a decision by the end of June 2026.
Well, thank you for that update, and thank you for your work on the Lemon case. That was absolutely a critical win here recently as well, particularly for religious liberty. And that's really what's so much a part of this conversation on Lemon and on Obergefell and other issues, is that religious liberty is under attack in America in many ways, and this first freedom of ours has been eroded slowly but surely over the decades. And now with this court, we're seeing wins for religious liberty again, which is something that all Christians in America, and particularly Southern Baptists, who's our main audience, want to see and are champions of. So Matt, remind us who Kim Davis is. About a decade or so, she was in the news quite a bit. She hasn't been in the news as much of late, but remind us who she is and what's at the heart of her case here.
Well, let me talk a little bit about who she is and then how she got into this situation. Just a couple of years before she was elected as the county clerk of Rowan County, Kentucky, she served as a deputy clerk under her mother, who was one of the longest running elected officials in Kentucky as the clerk. She was the deputy or one of several deputies that assisted her. But in Kim's own word, she was a bad person. A good mother, she said, but a bad person. She ended up messing up marriage. She had been married and divorced 4 times. She ended up remarrying her second husband, Joe, and she's been married to Joe now for almost 30 years. But what happened is the godly mother-in-law that she had just a few years before this happened, while she was living a wayward life, not following the Lord, on a deathbed wish, asked Kim to just get your life together, take your family, and go to church. So just to check off the box and go to church with her family to acknowledge her dying mother-in-law's dying wish, she did. But, she went to a church. She found one locally that same night, and the pastor was preaching about the book of Galatians, and that's when she became a broken woman. She heard about forgiveness. She confessed her sins, and she was a totally changed woman after that. So then God uses that moment, and a couple of years later, she becomes elected as county clerk. And the Supreme Court was taking up this case of Obergefell on same-sex marriage. As a county clerk, when she won in 2014, she immediately approached the Clerk Association and she spoke on their behalf with the legislature and the then Democratic governor, asking them to do something to give religious accommodation in anticipation if the Supreme Court were to go the wrong way. Nobody listened. Well, the Supreme Court on June 26, 2015 did go to the wrong way in a 5-4 opinion. She was then confronted. This was on her Friday. The next Monday, what does she do? She asked for religious accommodation. Very simple. Just remove my name from the certificate. I cannot, as a Christian, endorse with my name a union under marriage that God does not design between two people of the same sex. So she stopped issuing all licenses to anyone until she was able to get an accommodation response. Well, the then governor said, no, you just have to issue it. So she was sued the week of July, right after this. And she said, I can't issue this license. I just want my name off the certificate. Just take my name off. Believe it or not, in Kentucky, for conscience reasons, you could opt out of issuing hunting or fishing licenses. And the governor had actually opted out his own attorney general from defending the marriage definition in their constitution. That was before the Supreme Court, and hired outside counsel. But he would not accommodate Kim's simple request to take her name off. So she was sent to prison for 6 days. I'll never forget the time that I visited her in prison with the orange prisoner's jumpsuit. And while she was in prison, one of the deputy clerks, scratched out her name and issued a license to the people that are still litigating this case against her. And they got a license without her name on it, scratched through. They were upset. They asked the judge to change it. And the governor said, no, the one who wouldn't give her the accommodation, it's okay. The license is still valid. So they got their license. She was thrown in jail. Then a new governor was elected, Matt Bevin, a Republican, in December of 2015. He gave her and all the clerks an accommodation request that she asked for, remove their names. He granted that. Then in April of 2016, the legislature unanimously also passed a law allowing all the clerks to have their names off their certificates. Exactly what she said. So why is this case still going? It's because David Ermold and David Moore wanted to mock her Christian faith. They hated her Christian faith. And so they came after her, and that's what's been happening for the last 10 years, William, persecuting this woman. They never anticipated to get married. They interviewed with GQ magazine in December of 2015, said that wasn't even something they talked about. But they saw Kim Davis in the media. They went down there to harass her. They filmed it, put it on social media. It went viral. And then they started to go ahead and pursue their charade of getting married. So they got their certificate. She got her accommodation, but they wanted a pound of flesh because it doesn't have her name on it. And so they've come after her relentlessly And in 2023, we went to a trial with two juries, two separate plaintiffs, the Ermold plaintiffs and another set, same day, same courtroom, same judge, same evidence. One jury came back 0 damages. The other jury came back $100,000 for the Ermold Moore plaintiffs. And then the judge tacked on $260,000 against her personally. So now we're at the Supreme Court with Kim Davis facing $360 plus $1,000 in judgment against her personally, not on behalf of the government, against her as an individual, for a simple request: remove my name from the license, a request that actually was granted to her afterward. And so we're asking two things. One, that the Supreme Court acknowledge that the First Amendment religious free exercise is an absolute defense for Kim, but more specifically, and this is what's catching the headlines, and this is the core issue of the case, that the 2015 Obergefell opinion should be overturned.
Well, thank you for that background. I mean, there's so much stuff there that even I wasn't aware of. I've seen the media allegations about Kim and her previous marriages, but as you tell that story, you know, what I hear is a great story of redemption, of redemption in Christ. And it reminds me of, you know, of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul talks about how God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And so here she is now, you know, happily married for 30 years and just had such courage to stand up and say, I can't do this against my conscience and against my religious beliefs. Matt, so they are seeking $360,000 in damages against her personally. This just seems like it's driven out of spite. They already have their marriage certificate, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And in fact, they got that in September of 2015. In September of 2015. So that's when she was in prison for 6 days. This other deputy clerk scratched out her name and issued the license to them. They were very upset because her name did not clearly appear on it. But the court and the governor, who wouldn't give her that accommodation, said, no, it's okay without her name on it. Well, if we would have done that at the very beginning, there would never have been an issue. So they got their license. She got the accommodation, both by executive order and by a unanimously passed law in Kentucky. But they wanted to come after her. So they continually harassed her. And in fact, David Ermold even ran for her clerk position. He came down to file the paperwork, and guess who helped him file for the clerk's position to run for the elected office? It was Kim Davis, sat down with David Ermold to help him file to run against her. This is the kind of Christian transformation that happened with Kim Davis. She's a humble woman who loves the Lord. I remember back in 2015, I got a call from BuzzFeed, and BuzzFeed said, what do you have to say when the other side says they just want to have marriage, but your client's made a mess of marriage? I didn't realize she had been divorced for 4 times. I called Kim and I said, what happened? And she said, I was a bad woman. I acknowledge that, but I've been totally transformed. And she took me through that dramatic conversion experience. And so every time after that, William, when I talked about Kim Davis, it didn't matter what media it was on. I said, well, in order to understand why Kim Davis cannot issue a marriage license between two people of the same sex with her name on it, you have to understand her background. She will not dishonor her Lord by having the audacity to sanction a relationship, call it marriage, and put her stamp of approval with her name affixed to it.
Well, again, it's incredible courage, and it's courage that I think that many Christians have not shown. Some certainly have. We've seen stories about, you know, people like, you know, Jack, the cake baker from Colorado, who he had his own 12-year saga, multiple lawsuits. And Kim is a similar story here. It's been going on for over a decade. I think a lot of people have been wondering why now, like why bring this case now? Why ask not just to get justice for Kim Davis and not being responsible for these damages, but also to go ahead and ask the Supreme Court to revisit the entirety of the Obergefell decision?
William, that's a good question. And the reason is because it's taken 10 years to get this far. So in 2023, what happened is David Ermold and David Moore came after her and stripped her of her governmental immunity, so that if there was a damage award against her, it would be against the government, and they wanted to pierce that immunity protection. So they pursued that. The lower court judge allowed that to happen so that they could sue her individually for what happened in 2015. And we went to a trial, and it was two juries literally seated side by side for two sets of plaintiffs. They heard the same evidence the same day, and they went back and they deliberated. One jury came back with 0 damages. This one came back for $50,000. Now, David Ermold originally said, well, he had lost wages. He lost his job at the university because of Kim Davis. Well, we called the HR person for the university, and they said, no, it had nothing to do with Kim Davis. So then during the trial, they had no evidence, no experts, nothing, no calculation of damages. They just said, well, they have hurt feelings. Their feelings were hurt because Kim Davis wouldn't issue the license to them. They had no counseling, no medical treatment, no lost wages, no out of pocket. They just said hurt feelings, $50,000 a piece. And amazingly, the jury granted $50,000 a piece. Then the judge tacked on the $260,000. So from there, it went to the Court of Appeals. And earlier this year, the Court of Appeals issued a ruling on that case. And now we're at the United States Supreme Court. So it's literally taken 10 years to get to this point. So the two issues obviously are, number one, Kim Davis deserves a First Amendment defense because they are alleging emotional damages without any actual damages. They're alleging that words hurt their feelings, and therefore she ought to pay. Well, under those situations, you have a First Amendment as a defense. Kim Davis got the religious accommodation she was requesting, but the courts would never grant her the First Amendment as a defense. So that's a big issue that we're asking the Supreme Court to grant. And if that's the case, then there's no damages at all. The First Amendment's an absolute defense to Kim Davis. But beyond that, you have to ask the question of, well, that might be putting a Band-Aid on cancer, because what caused this in the first place? And that is Obergefell. So the Chief Justice, John Roberts, actually issued a very strong dissent in 2015. And he said 5 lawyers, that's his words, 5 lawyers, imposed their will, not a legal judgment, and that their opinion has nothing to do with the Constitution. So he was very, very adamant that this decision was wrong. It had no basis in the Constitution or the court's precedent. Also dissenting were Thomas and Alito. And Thomas, in the Dobbs decision in 2022 that overturned the abortion decision, said, there's other cases that are built on the same quicksand that the abortion decision was built on. And one of those he named was Obergefell. The court ought to reconsider that. And then in 2016, Thomas also actually issued a statement mentioning Kim Davis by name, saying she was the first but not the last victim of Obergefell with regards to the court's cavalier treatment of the Constitution and marriage. And the court made this mess, and only the court can fix it. So we have 3 justices on the bench right now that were part of the original dissent. We need 4 justices to vote to take a case. We need 5 justices to win. So we need another justice, because they're all pretty strong in their dissents, to agree to take the case. We need 2 more justices, and we've got several new justices on the bench to be able to win. 2 justices that were on the bench that were part of the 5 are there. The other 3 are gone. Those that are gone are Kennedy, Breyer, and Ginsburg. The 2 remaining that were on the bench then would be Kagan and Sotomayor. So I think we have a good chance to ask the court to overturn this unlawful, unconstitutional opinion issued by, in the Chief Justice's words, 5 lawyers.
Right. And this brings us back really to the original Obergefell ruling, which was authored by Kennedy, correct?
Yeah, yes. And Score, he's gone now. And so what Kennedy did, there's a thing called due process. And there is such a thing as due process in the Constitution, but due process is that you have a right to be informed of the charge against you and you have a right to defend yourself against that charge. That's due process of law. But what the justices did some years ago in the decade of the liberal decades of the Supreme Court is they created what's called substantive due process. Well, there is no such thing. It's judge-made. Substantive due process, even as weird as it is, would say, is there an enumerated right in the Constitution? Well, First Amendment free speech, that's enumerated. Free exercise of religion, enumerated. Are there other so-called things that are not enumerated, but they want to protect them anyway? So in other words, they want to invent something outside the Constitution. And they called that substantive due process. In order to qualify for what they called then substantive due process, whatever it was you wanted to protect that's not enumerated had to be deeply rooted in our history, such that if you don't protect that which is deeply rooted in our history, the concept of, quote, ordered liberty, close quote, would come unraveled. Something so important, deeply rooted, that if you don't protect it, it would affect our notion of ordered liberty. Well, let's put that in the context of same-sex marriage. Is it deeply rooted in our history? No. In fact, it's just the opposite. Same-sex activity, sodomy, was criminalized. Certainly, marriage has always been the union of a man and a woman. It doesn't even qualify for the liberalized version of substantive due process. So there's been a movement by the court, and Dobbs was clearly the pinnacle of this, to get away from this judge-made substantive due process that has no basis in the Constitution, and it's basically just in the minds of the justices. So that's what happened in Dobbs. They overruled abortion because it was based on what they called substantive due process. Obergefell is even worse than that. It goes way beyond, a step beyond this judge-made substantive due process to just invent it. That's why Chief Justice John Roberts used the term 5 lawyers imposed their will, not a legal judgment, and their opinion has nothing to do with the Constitution. Those are strong words, and that's from the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, I believe that I've heard Obergefell be referred to as a legal fiction before.
Yes, right.
And it certainly is. But I have a master's of divinity, so I approach these political issues from a theological angle more than from a legal angle. Though in my time in Washington, D.C., working there, I got to know some great legal minds and philosophical minds like Ryan Anderson and Roger Severino. We worked together on something called the First Amendment Defense Act in the wake of Obergefell. And, beyond the fact that it's a legal fiction, many of us would argue it's just fundamentally, it's an ontological fiction. It's not something that exists. There is, while we refer to it, we use phrases like gay marriage or same-sex marriage. We understand, Christians understand, and I would argue the natural order teaches, the natural law teaches that marriage is a union between a man and a woman for a lifelong monogamous union to care for whatever offspring that they create. Marriage fundamentally has to have a procreative possibility to it. And this has been the millennia held view by so many Christians. Matt, as you tell this story, I am curious to hear what happened in our American jurisprudence that another legal fiction of substantive due process is given more weight than the natural law, than the First Amendment. How did things get so upside down here?
You really have to go back to the late 1800s with Harvard Law School, and they ended up moving away from the black letter law, like the Blackstone's commentaries that everybody, both in Europe and the United States, read, that are filled with scripture, by the way, as the basis for civil law and other kinds of constitutional law and so forth, and criminal law as well. And they moved away from that to case law, where you look at what previous judges or courts have said, and it kind of evolves after that. And so as a result of that, the idea of the rule of law began to change, and it was just basically judge-made law. And so law schools began teaching that the Constitution and the words in the history don't really matter. It's really a document that's outdated, antiquated, and it's up to the justices to make it a, quote, living document and impose their own will. So that's how they came up with this idea of substantive due process. They didn't like the fact that they were limited to the things that are enumerated, So they created this idea of substantive due process, and then they went far beyond it. And Obergefell is like the epitome of that judicial activism. And so when you go past that concept of the rule of law, you get abortion that has nothing to do with the Constitution. You get this Obergefell opinion that literally goes against millennia of human history from the very creation of, Adam and Eve. It's pretty objective. You don't have to have any religion or religious doctrine to understand, or political affiliation or geographical boundary, that it's obvious, it's subjective, part of the natural order. There's two sexes, male and female. They're complementary. It's marriage between a man and a woman that is necessary for the survival of the human race, both to propagate, but also to train that next generation. And so when you have the audacity to actually assume that you can rewrite the definition of marriage to be something that it's not, to go into a very sex-based relationship, gender-based relationship, and say gender doesn't matter, you literally have changed the whole course, thrown the whole course of history and natural law and the natural created order out the window. This is, I think, what caused some of the strong dissents that were in the Obergefell opinion. And one of those, of course, is by the Chief Justice John Roberts.
Yeah. And so with our remaining time here, I'd say about two more main questions. First is, if you prevail, what happens? Will we be will we be shredding gay marriage certificates in the street, or rounding up people? No, what would actually happen if Obergefell was overturned?
Excellent question. For those that already have a marriage license, nothing would happen. There is the Respect for Marriage Act that was passed by Congress, pushed at the very end of December a few years ago. That particular federal law grandfathers in anybody who has a marriage license. So say it's reversed today. All those people who have licenses, no matter what it is, those licenses continue to remain valid for as long as they are in a marriage relationship, or that license is valid and they're alive. But what would immediately happen is the states would revert back to where they were before June 26, 2015. We had 30 plus states with state constitutional amendments that said marriage is the union of a man and woman. Those didn't go away. I don't know of any that have been repealed. And beyond those state constitutions, virtually every state has statutes, and those are still, for the most part, still in existence. They would come back into existence. So we would see something like we saw after Dobbs overturned Roe. States would have their pro-life laws come back into effect. States would have their pro-marriage union of a man and woman laws come back into effect. Then what you would have is people on the state level have discussion, debate, maybe voter initiatives, if they wanted to change it. But the bottom line is that the nation would almost immediately revert to marriage as a union of man and woman, with the exception of a couple of states. Virtually every state would revert back to the way it was before June 26, 2015.
Thank you for that. Last question here. Why is it so important for this to prevail? And how can we be praying for you at Liberty Counsel and for Kim Davis? What's at stake here for religious liberty in America, and frankly, for the foundation of our constitutional republic and our very system of government?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I appreciate people praying, because this is so critical that we have justices that take the case and that we also win this case. It's critically important for Kim Davis. Obviously, she will be bankrupt if it doesn't go, if it doesn't get reversed. Beyond that, it's the First Amendment free exercise of religion. If somebody like Kim, who actually gets an accommodation, can be forced into bankruptcy and persecuted for 10 years, then anybody can. So the religious liberty issue goes far beyond this issue or this case to everybody. And finally, Obergefell was wrong. It damaged the Constitution. It damaged marriage. It damaged the family. It has damaged the country. And the victims like Kim Davis, while she is the first one, she's not the last one. It distorts the very concept of the liberty and also objective reality in the natural created order. It has to go. It is a cancer that will infect the rest of the Constitution and bleed over, which it already has, into other areas. And that cancer needs to be excised. Obergefell needs to be overturned.
Well said, Matt. Thank you so much. If you're listening to this, please do pray for Matt Staver, for Liberty Counsel, and for Kim Davis, that justice would prevail in this case, that our Constitution would be upheld, that 4 justices would agree to hear it, and that 5 justices would agree to overturn Obergefell. Matt, where can they follow along with Liberty Counsel's work on this?
Thank you, William. They can go to lc.org, just 2 letters, lc.org. And for this particular case, lc.org/Kim, lc.org/Kim.
All right, we'll put those in the show notes. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be praying for your success, and we'll be following along closely.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.